Lecture 8, Translation Theories, Part 2. Functional Theories. The 1970s and 1980s witnessed a shift from the static linguistic typologies of translation and the emergence of a functionalist and communicative approach to the analysis of translation. These theories subsumed the early work on text type and language function. The theory of translational action, Scuppo's theory, and text analysis model. Text type theory, built on the concept of equivalence, which is the milestone in linguistic theories. The text, rather than the word or sentence, is deemed the appropriate level at which communication is achieved and at which equivalence must be sought. Rice links the functional characteristics of text types to translation methods. The main characteristics of each text type can be summarized as follows. Informative. Number 1, informative. So this is the first characteristic of a text type. It is concerned with the plain communication of facts, information, knowledge, opinions, etc. The language dimension used to transmit the information is logical or referential. The content or topic is the main focus of the communication. 2. Expressive. It denotes the creative composition, wherein the author uses the aesthetic dimension of the language. 3. Operative. The purpose is to induce behavioral responses, that is to say, to appeal to or persuade the reader or receiver of the text to act in a certain way. 4. Audiomedial. It refers to films and visual or spoken advertisements, which supplement the other three functions with visual images, music, etc. Rice proposes specific translation methods according to text type. These methods can be described as follows. 1. The target text of an informative text should transmit the full referential or conceptual content of the source text. The translation should be plain prose without redundancy, but with the use of explication when required. 2. The target text of an expressive text should transmit aesthetic and artistic form of the source text. The translation should use the identifying method, with the translator adopting the standpoint of source text author. 3. The target text of an operative text should produce the desired response in the target text receiver. The translation should create an equivalent effect among target text readers. Audiomedial texts require, number 4, audiomedial texts require the supplementary method, written words with visual images and music. The text type approach moves translation theory beyond a consideration of lower linguistic levels, the mere words, beyond even the effect they create, towards a consideration of the communicative purpose of translation. Translational action theory. This theory views translation as purpose-driven, product-oriented, or outcome-oriented human interaction, with special emphasis on the process of translation as message transmission or translational action from a source text as a communicative process involving a series of roles and players, the most important of whom are the source text producer or the original author, the target text producer or the translator, and the target text receiver, the final recipient of the target text. The theory stresses the production of the target text as functionally communicative for the reader. That is to say, the form and the genre of the target text, for instance, must be guided by what it is functionally suitable in the target text culture, which is determined by the translator, who is the expert in translational action and whose role is to make sure that the intercultural transfer takes place satisfactorily. Nord elucidates that translating is essentially a purposeful activity or behavior in which translation is viewed as a form of mediated intercultural communication. Scopo's theory. As already mentioned in the fourth period of the historical survey in the previous lectures, Scopo's theory stresses the interactional pragmatic aspects of translation, arguing that the shape of the target text should be determined by the function or scopos, the Greek word for aim or purpose. So scopos is the Greek word for aim or purpose. That it is intended to fulfill in the target context, and it may vary according to the recipient. The corollary is that the translator should use the translation strategies which are most appropriate to achieve the purpose for which target text is intended, irrespective of whether they are deemed to be the standard way to produce in a particular translation text. In short, when producing a target text, the end justifies the means. It is worth noting that an awareness of the requirements of the function expands the possibilities of translation, increases the range of possible translation strategies, and releases the translator from the corset of an unenforced and often meaningless literalness. It is the target readers who will prompt the translator to translate, to paraphrase, or even re-edit the target text as the most appropriate strategy to be adopted in a given situation. The Scopus theory is criticized by the linguistically oriented approaches on the ground of the oversimplification that it is inherent in functionalism. The focus on the message at the expense of richness of meaning and to the detriment of the authority of source language text. Another criticism of this theory is that even though a translation may indeed fulfill its intended scopus perfectly, decisions on the micro level are concerned. Here we come to the sociolinguistic theories of translation. These theories endeavor to link translation to communicative theory. For as long as individuals have communicated with one another through the mediation of someone else, there has probably been a realization that mediators do something more complex and more interesting than simply substitute their own words one by one for the originals. Since the early 1950s, however, there has been an upsurge in serious studies of translation, both in its theoretical, historical, and professional dimensions, and in its practice at the point when translators do something in response to their own reading of a text, and which leads to the production of a second text. In particular, it is now understood that translators do not simply say in one language what somebody or some piece of writing has said in another, whatever translation is in its entirety. It seems to involve semiotic, linguistic, textual, lexical, social, sociological, cultural, and psychological aspects or elements, all of which are being studied nowadays as determining factors in whatever the translator does. It is also becoming clear that, as in any other form of rewriting, this implies manipulation and relates directly to ideology, power, value systems, and perceptions of reality. One of the many questions that recur explicitly or implicitly in these investigations is whether there is something objective, there is some objective entity, linguistic, semantic, or psychological, expressed in or by an original, which can be then captured by a different text, the translation. In other words, is there something in behind, underneath, or belonging to a piece of writing in one language which can be extrapolated and safely packaged in another? After all, at first sight, something seems to survive and pass more or less intact from one text to another in the process and the product of translation. We may therefore ask whether or how this actually happens and what that something may be. Certain aspects of language, such as words and grammar, appear to disappear or change completely in translation, and yet the meaning, what might be termed the semantic import, usually survives the process quite well. Beyond these impressions, what is it then, if anything, that is actually transferred between one text and another? Is it some part, ingredient, or linguistic element of the text itself? Or is it something less direct about the text, such as a particular reader's reaction or interpretation of it? And what happens to those elements which are not transferred? Are they irrelevant, surplus to requirements, treated of no importance, and simply ignored? Is translation some kind of science, pure or applied, prescriptive or descriptive, or is it a practical art or craft which cannot be discussed until after the event? Analogously to a conversation about the beauty of a sunset or a bird in flight, if the notion that something remains unscathed in the process of translation is too extreme, then perhaps there may be aspects of the original and the translation which, if not identical, are at least equivalent to one another. For some time now, the notion of equivalence, or rather equivalencies, has been debated with varying degrees of enthusiasm and conviction. So, the notion of equivalence has been debated with varying degrees of enthusiasm and conviction. It may also be that translation is merely an approximate, imprecise procedure, and that any text has so many dimensions that equivalence on one may be incompatible with equivalence on some others. For example, linguistic equivalence which is an extreme case of which would be word-for-word translation, may conflict with the dynamic equivalence. Here, dynamic equivalence means or refers to the stimulating or the process of stimulating an effect in the reader of the translation, similar to that caused in the reader of the original. In the sense that if the linguistic surface of both texts is similar, the effect on their readers may necessarily be very different and vice versa. And does translation deal with what the original author intended or simply what is expressed by the text? Among these approaches to research on translation, which are yielding useful insights nowadays, translation studies has been in particular favor since the mid-1960s. Translation studies concentrates on describing and analyzing the procedure or processes rather than commenting on the product itself and asking how well or badly any particular translation has been done. This non-prescriptive approach, among others, is interested in how translation is actually done, examining the methods that have been used throughout history and asking how texts fit into the receiving cultures. Much work is also being carried out on the teaching of translation, with or without some kind of theoretical or academic underpinning. Universities and similar institutions educate graduates who go on to earn their living as translators. Some courses use translation merely as a methodological tool for language teaching, without claiming to train translators, while others provide training in all aspects of the translator's work, including practice in various registers, gathering and storing terminology, compiling databases, documentation. So, closely related to teaching is assessment or evaluation, quality assurance or revision of translation as part of the process itself, or carried out on the product. It is done on various levels, from the practitioner's own impressionistic assessment of a first draft or a teacher's equally subjective, but perhaps more experience-based comments on a student's piece of work to more academic attempts to develop systematic methods for the evaluation of professional work. The profession of the translator, with its problems and practical considerations, is sporadically, though seldom systematically, treated in journals and newsletters. The practice of the profession under pressure, working to deadlines, satisfying different types of client, using dictionaries of all kinds, whether monolingual or multilingual, general or technical, hard copy or computer-based, by in-house or freelance practitioners, making use of expert or other informants. So making use of expert or other informants, often the clients themselves, is occasionally discussed, usually on many different levels. Despite much research, or even calls for general theories and systems to explain or describe the translation process, Most work on the subject continues to address specific problems and individual elements or aspects of translation, including comparisons on brief texts with their originals. These studies range from the treatment of such detailed points as puns or culture-specific terms to advice on how to handle legal documents between systems which have neither terminology nor legal entities in common. They may rely on intuitive reactions to the readability of a particular translation or on academic investigations of contrastive structural linguistics. The volume of work being done and the multiplicity of approaches used suggests that the study of translation is actively attempting to emerge from its infancy. Much of the same may be said on other levels of language. Let's take other branches of language. Let's take pragmatics as an example. Since 1938, when Charles Marst defined semiotics as the use of signs governed by syntactic, semantic, and pragmatic rules, but more particularly since 1959, when Rodolphe Carap explained the pragmatics refers to the relationships between signs and their users. The discipline has been developed with enthusiasm by philosophers and linguists alike. It entered an especially meaningful phase precisely in 1962, when J.L. Austin's contribution to the subject was published under the title How to Do Things with Words, which showed that when using language, people do not just talk or write to one another, but rather they perform actions. They do things, usually in contexts that combine linguistic and non-linguistic elements, part of the context in which they communicate consisting of the knowledge, beliefs, and assumptions of all concerned. Following Austin's work, pragmatics has focused on the conditions which permit speakers and writers to achieve what they want to achieve by bringing about certain modifications in the behavior, knowledge, attitudes, or beliefs of others. It studies what language users mean, as distinct from what their language means. The rules and principles governing their use of language over and above the rules of language itself, grammar or vocabulary, and what makes some uses of language more appropriate than others in certain situations. In general, pragmatic approaches attempt, as well as semantic approaches to translation, attempt to explain translation, procedure, process, and product from the point of view of what is potentially done. So, as has been said earlier, linguistic approaches as well, semantic approaches as well as pragmatic approaches to translation, all of which attempt to explain translation procedure, process, and product form, or from the point of view of what is potentially done by the original author or by the text, what is potentially done in the translation as a response to the original, how and why it is done in that way in that context. If we return to the question of whether there is something in an original text which is carried over in its translation, according to the to pragmatics. Pragmaticists might suggest that something does indeed survive in the process, namely, at the very least, what is potentially done by or in the original text, since the translation has the same capability. We say that the very least because, of course, if an original text, for example, informs, entertains, demands, or a payment of a debt or apologizes for some mistake, the translation will be expected to not only perform these actions but also do so in a manner similar to the original. It will have to convey the same and not different information. The entertainment will have to be of the same kind in both texts. So if we distinguish syntactic from sentential units, on the other hand, Sander Hervey defines sentence building as endowing a meaningful linguistic unit with an illocutionary function. He explains that although illocutionary functions can be understood across the most diverse cultural boundaries, their cultural relativity makes it difficult to transfer them in translation. He proposes a strategic approach which keeps very much in mind that to convey these functions, English, for example, predominantly uses intonation. German, on the other side, prefers illocutionary particles, while Hungarian resorts to sequential focus. The mechanisms available to signal the distinction between theme or information already known to readers and dream or new information vary from language to language. It is said that inflection rather than word order largely fulfills this function in Russian. A translator then has to decide how to convey the theme-rhyme structure of an original text using whatever means the target language can offer. A good fit requires replication of the original theme-rhyme structure, communicative value, message and thrust, while respecting the target language's grammar and style. Yet, just as willingness to risk deviance may mark a good writer, so also it may mark a good translator.